Okay, so after 35 years of working as a performer and a creator, 10 years of working in conflict, and a few years of bringing these fields together to create large-scale events that use choreographic thinking to enable discussion, to expand discussion and exchange around complicated societal issues, here's what I'm noticing. Conflict is inevitable. Okay, it's going to happen, and thank God. Because conflict is the place that we can find out what matters, and where we can start to understand why it's happening. So we have to be able to differentiate, though, if we're going to understand why this is important. Because destructive conflict is not inevitable. So these are two different things. Conflict is this rich place where what we care about, what matters, what is possible is moving around in this complex mixture of dynamic. Destructive conflict is stuck energy. And this is what I see. Conflict is the origin of all creative action. And when we recognize the difference between conflict and destructive conflict, then we can start to notice that every time something new needs to emerge, it emerges from this place of dynamic tension that is a place of possibility. So what we pay attention to, what we look for, determines what we can see. There's no neutral space. There's no neutral situation. Every situation, every space we step into is formed. It's formed from the inside, from the way we think. It's formed from the outside by systems and patterns and beliefs. And a lot of these, the way it's formed, comes from the way that people decide to organize ideas physically. So it's choreographic. I think of conflict, choreography, communication in terms of action, because I find that's the best way for us to see what's happening and to decide if we want to do something different. So what are we choosing to pay attention to? Which actions are we choosing as a result? My overarching goal or question at the moment is to understand this. Is it possible to reduce the amount of violence in the world? And if it is, what would it take for that to happen? So I started bringing these choreographic ideas and thinking into conflict work, not because I wanted to figure out what to do with dance, not because I want to bring arts out to the world. I don't care about that. I did it because it works. I discovered that the practices, the methodologies, the technologies that dance artists are accustomed to developing and changing and throwing out and bringing back are effective in helping people step into conflict with their intelligence and their hearts intact, and to help them choose their actions consciously. So I'm going to keep it practical from here on out, and I'm going to just describe to you some of the projects that I've been developing. The first one is called Not on Not, and this is a choreographic public dialogue. That's what I've been calling these projects. I'm hopefully going to find a better name eventually. And this one is focused on immigration. I initially developed it with Bill Forsyth, the choreographer, who's also my husband and collaborator. And sorry, confusing here. So here's some images from Berlin, where I did it a few years ago. So the project takes place in 3 stages, and it uses the idea of giving space meaning. Let me see if I can remove this. Okay, so what you're seeing up on the screen right now is a section where, if you imagine there's a big triangle, 20 meters by 20 meters. On either side of the triangle is a video monitor, and the triangle is divided, so there's 3 sections. And sets of statements come up, and people are asked to walk into the side of the triangle that is connected to the statement that makes sense to them. So it begins, for example, A, B, C. A, I have descendants who are German. B, I don't have any German descendants. C, I'm not sure. So people divide themselves into quite clear groups. There's clear borders. They're crossing lines. They're creating these groups. The next question, for example, is, I feel German. I don't feel German. I'm not sure. And here what always happens is a good portion of the German people who have German ancestry leave and go over to where it says, I don't feel German. Half of the immigrant background people move over and say they do feel German, and quite a few people don't really know. And this goes on, so we move through a series of these statements, and they have to do first with identity. Where do I come from? Where do I feel like I belong? What are my values? Where did I learn them? And then into more concrete things like headscarves should be allowed everywhere. Headscarves should be banned completely. Headscarves should be allowed in certain situations. So what happens over the course of this takes about 20 minutes is that the solidity of the borders between groups becomes much more porous. And the connections that exist between people who might sometimes imagine themselves to be quite divided become more evident. So after this section, we move into a section where there's 100 people in the event, and we divide them onto 25 tables. And we try to divide them so they're sitting with people they don't know. And then there's a very choreographed conversation that happens. I moderate it from the front. I offer a question. Person A at each table has 2 minutes to speak. And then person B. So it goes around the table like that. So it's quite tense. And it can create an atmosphere of anxiety. And sometimes I do that on purpose, because if people just walk into the typical conversation they have, oftentimes they end up talking on the level of strategy. This should happen. No, this should happen. And we very rarely get down to the level where we're saying, here's what I care about. This is why I care about it. Here's my experience that's led me to believe what I do. So one thing that's happening secretly during these conversations is the tables are covered with paint. And this is a part of the project that I developed with Tommaso Carnetto, who's the director of the Academy of Visual Arts in Frankfurt. I was trying to find a way to create documentation that wasn't boring. And so we covered the tables in paint, we covered the tables in paper, so you can't tell. And then while these people are having this conversation, while they move toward and away from each other, while they gesture, they're leaving traces. And after the conversations, we quickly pull off the paper. We make a new print of each table. These are some of the students from the academy. And then we lay them on the floor, and you can see we write the names of the people where they were. So you can see who sat where, and you can see the nature of the conversation, the nature of the exchange. And this turns into not only a record of the kind of conversation that happened, but a way for people to translate what their experience was, to recode it. And we lay them on the ground, and people walk, often for a long time together through them, looking at them to understand in a new way what just happened. Okay, next project is called Violence Recode. And this is a project that I developed with students at Lyndon State College in the United States. And going into this project, my question was coming from the anthropologist Paul Farmer, who said something along the lines of, how do large-scale social forces like racism and sexism and nationalism, structural violence, how do these systems make their way into the individual experience by making their way into our bodies? And so I started thinking about, okay, it's so hard to talk about these things like racism without saying, how do you feel about racism? And having kind of a surface conversation. So how do we bring it down to the level of the individual body so that this thing is not just something outside of us that's just hopeless and forget it, we can't do anything about it, but how it is impacting us? How are we impacting the systems? So I decided to use posture as a way to look at it. So I worked with the students and I said, okay, let's look at 7 kinds of structural violence: racism, sexism, nationalism, all these different ways. And let's think of scenarios where this is showing up in the single body of an individual. So the way it ended up working out is there's two long lines of chairs facing each other, maybe 3 meters apart, and an image comes up on screens behind each line. And what I've discovered is it's really important how you frame these kind of events, because people, of course, don't like you to tell them what to do. And so how do we invite people into a real question? Not a lecture, not telling them how things should be, but a real question that we are researching together because we don't know the answer yet. So an image comes up, everyone adopts, everyone takes on that posture, and then two statements come up that provide two different contexts for being in that posture. So here's some images from Vermont. Here's my musical director. There's also 20 or 25 drummers who are surrounding the event, who provide not only the rhythm and the drive for the event, but provide the container that holds this very artificial structure and makes it part of an organic flow. And this is the first time I used music. And of course I've been working with music and motion for 40 years. But this is the first time I consciously used it in one of these events, and it was very helpful. Okay, so interspersed into these postures, and I'll show you a bit about the postures in a moment, are a series of small, intense conversations. So you can see here, the people are asked to walk to the person opposite them. They have a question. This person has a minute to speak. This person has a minute to speak. And these, again, are quite pressed situations. It's very short. The questions are very big. And it develops a sudden intimacy between people. I've had so many people say, I've never had a conversation, for one thing, on that topic. And I've never had that sudden glimpse into the life of another person, and in particular into how these systems affect the life of another person. So here's how it works, and maybe we can try it a little bit. So an image comes up. So if you're interested, would you all please take on this posture? Okay, so now if you just feel how it feels to be in that posture. Okay? And now here's the first statement. Now everyone just be a man waiting for his wife. Okay. Now, a man waiting for his husband. And what often happens inside this is because the structural violence system of heterosexism, bias against gay people, even if we're very consciously not biased against gay people, it's so prevalent in our society that it makes its way into our body, into what feels normal. And so there's this little shift that happens. And the reason I do this is because oftentimes talking about bias, talking about these things is very hard to get hold of. But with our body, we can kind of sneak up on our mind. And so it's a way of becoming conscious. And it's not something you have to talk about, but it's something you notice, like, wow, I can't believe I just had that sexist thought. I'm a woman, for God's sake. Okay, let's do one more. Take on this posture. Okay. You're sitting on a plane during a storm. Okay? You're sitting on a plane during a storm with a female pilot. And this is what always happens. We start laughing, and that's how we decided which postures to use, because we start laughing, because we feel it. We feel it happening inside us. Okay. So then this is interspersed with questions, and these questions are things like, how does your skin color affect what happens in your life? And interestingly, this is the version I used in Germany, because in America we said, what is your racial identity? But in Germany, that question doesn't work. So this project, I adapt it to each culture, each city that I move into, because structural violence finds its own way everywhere you go. Okay. So this is a project that I just did last weekend in Cologne, and it's a collaboration with the Michael Douglas Collective, who's a collective of artists. And I came into this project thinking, okay, I want to understand what the drivers of war are. I want to figure war out. And so after quite a bit of research and looking at this and working together, a new question came up. And the new question that I realized is the fundamental question that we can really say, this is a real question for us, is how do we, as individuals, through the way we think and the way we act, affect the level of violence in the world? Not in a theoretical way, but actually, how do we affect it? So you can sort of see on here, there's 6 stations in this room. This is the Kunststation St. Peter in Cologne, which is a beautiful space. There's 6 stations, 6 groups, and there's 3 lines that run between these groups. And each line has its own action. The groups rotate between these stations, so they experience each action. And the 3 actions are these. So the goal, as we moved into this project, was to think about attention. How are we shaping what we pay attention to? How are other people shaping what we pay attention to? And how is that affecting the level of violence in the world? And how do we think of attention as a form of action? So on one line, people organize themselves so that 4 people walk from each side. They meet in the middle, they create a circle, and they respond to a series of statements, like this. And this statement says, my beliefs about violence are similar to those of my parents. Now they're responding with hand gestures, so this means yes, this means no, and this is maybe, or I don't know. So let's practice that for a second, ready? And yes, no, maybe, I don't know. Okay, great. So the questions are like this. Violence is part of human nature. Yes, no, maybe, I don't know. Okay. Violence is learned behavior. It's something we learn. Okay. So these people are in the middle. They're placed in, again, kind of a pressurized situation because they're being watched. They're having to answer these questions which move along and have a lot to do with what we learned about violence, what we believe, why we believe it, positional questions. And they're responding with these gestures. And what these gestures do is allow for a lot of variation because people add quality and they add kind of intermediary things, or they repeat things, or they emphasize, or they get very doubtful. And so it becomes a very lively place in the center. And on the edges, so here's people responding. And then the second line is the listening line. So here we're focusing purely on attention. People are sitting still, they're listening to a voice, and the voice is moving them, moving their attention between being different people in different conflict situations, situations of war. It's asking them questions about where they would place themselves in certain situations. And this, as I say, I just did it, and the feedback I've been getting is that this really worked. And so, of course, this is something we do in theater all the time. We ask people to adopt the mindset and the viewpoint of someone else as a way to experience physically, because, of course, we experience it in our body, even when we're not moving. Now, running through the room is the third line, and this is a conversation line. We call it a river. And here people come in pairs, they get a question, and they walk together and they talk. And what the walking does is create the opposite of attention. It creates this very easy, kind of beautiful place where people take their own time. And so the first person would speak until they get to the middle, and then the second person would speak to the question. And when we get to the other side, they get a new question, and they go back. So there's this river, this beautiful river of exchange that's going on, the tempo of the people who are deciding what they want to speak about, how they want to speak, that's surrounding the tense people in the middle. And then the people on either side who are listening are using what they see as their ground for remembering or for imagining. So the reason these projects have been interesting for me is that they're not only a place where I have a chance to research with others, but where I have a chance to practice looking at the nature of systems. Because one of my primary interests is the question, how do we as individuals act inside of destructive systems? How do we create positive change? Because destructive systems are not pre-existing. We're not doomed in that sense. Every day, destructive systems are recreated by us, by the people inside of it. So we have a choice if we're going to continue to support these systems or if we're going to consciously break them down and build new systems in their place. So for me, this is hugely inspiring because it means that the hopelessness that I so often see in people around conflict, the conflicts in their lives that just seem like, you know, there's nothing they can do about it, or the insanity that you see happening in the world with the violence, what's happened in the last week in the United States and a lot of other places. This hopelessness is the result of a misunderstanding. Because these systems have to do only with what we choose to do. And I don't mean this in a utopian way, like we can change the world. I mean that we're already acting. We're already affecting these things. We may not be conscious of it, we may not be connected in our awareness of it, but these systems are us. So I mean this in a very practical way and also to challenge us as dance artists and as people to think, how do we act? But especially to notice, how are we already acting? What are we already doing? What else can we do that would change the way things go so that conflict becomes a rich place where we can learn what other people care about, we can tell them what we care about, where what we're passionate about, what gives life and makes life burn most brightly becomes possible. It's composed of us. So what are we choosing to do? Thank you very much.